Under the soft glow of Phoenix's evening lights, Elena Reyes stepped into the Pinnacle, a luxurious restaurant, only to face scorn from the staff. Her tan skin and simple gray sweater marked her as an outsider in their eyes, unworthy of their elite standards. Little did they know her husband, Lucas Reyes, a tech billionaire who revolutionized mobile payments, was moments away from turning their world upside down. If this tale of prejudice and triumph grabs you, hit that subscribe button to stick with this video. Share which country you're listening from. Where are you catching Elena's story? Hang around. The twist will surprise you. The sun had slipped below Phoenix's jagged skyline, leaving the city bathed in a twilight haze that blurred the edges of its steel and glass towers. Streetlights blinked awake, spilling golden light onto the pavement, while the low hum of evening traffic thrummed like a distant pulse. Elena Reyes emerged from the youth center on Roosevelt Street, her sneakers tapping softly against the weathered steps. At 29, she moved with a quiet resilience, her tan skin glowing faintly under the city's shimmer. Her gray sweater draped loosely over her frame, paired with jeans worn soft from countless days of work. Her hands, dusted with chalk from a whiteboard she'd been scrawling on, bore the marks of her afternoon teaching leadership to Latino teens from the city's overlooked corners. Tonight carried a different weight. Elena paused on the sidewalk, tilting her head to draw in the crisp October air. It smelled of roasted corn from a nearby street cart, laced with a sharper bite of car exhaust. She glanced at her watch, 6:47 p.m., and a faint smile curved her lips. Perfect timing. She had one stop to make before heading home, a surprise she'd been nursing for weeks. In 7 days, she and her husband, Lucas Reyes, would mark their 10th wedding anniversary. 10 years since they'd locked eyes across a cramped table at the Pinnacle, back when he was a pale, scrappy coder with wild ideas, and she was a community advocate with a spark that could light up a room. Now Lucas was a tech giant, a white man who'd climbed the ladder of a world not built for dreamers like him to share with someone like her. And Elena was his rock, his equal in every way. She wanted to take him back to that first night, to the place where their unlikely love took root. The Pinnacle wasn't just a restaurant. It was a shrine to Phoenix's elite, a towering edifice of glass and marble smack in the heart of downtown. Its name whispered privilege. Its doors were guarded by unspoken rules. Elena didn't care about its sheen tonight. She wasn't there to eat, not yet. She just needed to lock in a reservation for next Friday, a quiet tribute to their past, amid Lucas's relentless schedule of investor pitches and software unveilings. Her fingers grazed the phone in her pocket, itching to text him a quick, "Guess what I'm up to?" But she held back. This was her secret, a gift she'd reveal when the stars aligned. She set off, her stride steady, cutting through the evening bustle. Phoenix pulsed around her, suits barking into phones, couples clinking glasses at sidewalk cafes, a saxophonist coaxing a mournful tune from his horn. Elena's gaze traced the skyline, the amber glow of the Chase Tower piercing the deepening dusk. She loved this city, its grit, its soul. It was home, even when it stung. As a Latina woman married to a white man, she'd navigated its double takes, its whispered questions. But tonight, she wasn't dwelling on the weight of their eyes. She was picturing Lucas's grin when she'd spring this on him. The boyish one he'd flashed over their first meal, when he'd vowed to build her a future with nothing but code and courage. The trek to the Pinnacle took 15 minutes. Her sneakers whispered against the concrete. As she turned onto Monroe Street, the restaurant rose before her, its facade a monument to excess. Tall windows poured warm light onto the sidewalk, framing a scene of crisp linens and glittering glassware. Through the glass, Elena glimpsed Phoenix's power brokers, men in tuxedos, women in sleek gowns, their laughter a muted hum. She tugged at her sweater, suddenly conscious of the chalk on her fingers. She hadn't dressed up. Why would she? This was a pit stop, not the big night. Next week, she'd glide in on Lucas's arm, her curls swept up, her dress catching the light. Tonight, she was just Elena. Practical, chalk-dusted Elena. She reached the entrance, her reflection flickering in the spotless glass door. For a heartbeat, she wavered. The Pinnacle wasn't her scene. She'd rather be at a neighborhood dive, digging into tamales and rice with folks who didn't bat an eye at her jeans. But this place held history. Lucas's nervous laugh over shrimp and grits, his pale hand brushing hers as he promised a life they'd build together against the odds. She straightened, pushing the door open with a faint hiss. The air inside washed over her, cool, scented with lavender and the rich undertone of aged wine. The dining room's chatter dipped, a ripple of attention as eyes flicked toward her. The heavy glass door of the pinnacle swung shut behind Elena Reyes with a soft thud, sealing her into a world that felt as foreign as it was dazzling. The air inside was a sharp contrast to the crisp October night she'd left behind, cool, perfumed with lavender and the faint tang of polished leather. It wrapped around her like an invisible barrier. The marble floor gleamed beneath her sneakers, reflecting the golden glow of chandeliers that hung like constellations from the vaulted ceiling. Each crystal prism caught the light, scattering it across the room in a dance of wealth and privilege. Through the towering windows, Phoenix's skyline shimmered. But inside it was another universe, one of crisp white tablecloths, clinking crystal stemware, and the low murmur of the city's elite. Their voices, a velvet hum beneath the clatter of silverware. Elena took a step forward, her sneakers squeaking faintly against the polished stone, a sound that seemed to ripple through the dining room like a pebble dropped in still water. Heads turned, subtle but unmistakable. Men in tailored tuxedos pausing mid-sentence, women in sequined gowns glancing over the rims of their wine glasses. Their eyes lingered, not with curiosity but with something colder, sharper. She felt it instantly, that familiar weight pressing against her chest. The unspoken question of her presence. Her tan skin and gray sweater, a stark, but Elena didn't flinch. She wasn't here to belong, not tonight. She was here for Lucas, for their anniversary, for a reservation that would bring them back to where their love had sparked. The dining room stretched before her, a sea of pristine tables draped in linen so white it seemed to glow. Waiters in crisp black uniforms glided between them, silent as shadows, balancing trays of glistening oysters and delicate flutes of champagne. The air buzzed with the soft arrogance of wealth, laughter that tinkled like coins, conversations laced with names of power and profit. Elena's gaze swept the room, landing on the maitre d' station at its heart. It was a sleek podium of dark wood, a throne of authority in this gilded kingdom, and behind it stood Madison. A woman whose tailored black suit hugged her frame like armor. Her hair was pulled into a severe bun, her posture rigid, and her eyes, those eyes, locked onto Elena the moment she crossed the threshold. Madison's stare was a blade, cutting through the space between them with surgical precision. It raked over Elena from the unstyled curls framing her face to the scuffed toes of her sneakers, lingering on the chalk smudges that clung to her hands. There was no warmth in that gaze, no flicker of welcome, only a cold, calculating assessment that seemed to strip Elena bare. She'd seen that look before, too many times to count, in boardrooms and boutiques, on streets and in stairs. It was the look that weighed her worth by her skin, her clothes, and her very existence in a space not built for her. And even now, even knowing why she was here, a familiar voice whispered through the back of her mind. Maybe you don't belong. Maybe you never really have. But Elena had learned to meet it head-on, to let it slide off her like rain on glass. She straightened her shoulders, her breath steadying as she closed the distance to the podium. The room's chatter resumed, a low drone that filled the silence, but the weight of those initial glances clung to her like a damp cloth. She could feel the eyes still tracking her, some discreet, some brazen, as if her presence were a puzzle they couldn't quite solve. A man in a pinstriped suit muttered something to his companion, his lips curling into a smirk. A woman with diamonds dripping from her ears tilted her head, her brow arching in faint disdain. Elena ignored them, her focus narrowing to Madison, whose hands rested lightly on the podium, fingers poised over a leather-bound reservation book. The woman's face was a mask of professionalism, but beneath it simmered something harder, something that set Elena's nerves alight. "Good evening," Elena said, her voice warm and clear, cutting through the frost that hung between them. She offered a smile, small but genuine, the kind she'd use to disarm skeptics and win over strangers. "I'd like to make a reservation for next Friday if possible." Madison's lips pressed into a thin line, her head tilting just enough to signal dismissal. For a moment, she said nothing, her silence a wall as solid as the marble beneath their feet. Then her voice emerged, clipped and cold, each word a shard of ice. "We're fully booked for the next 2 months." Elena's smile didn't falter, though. She felt the sting of that tone deep in her gut. She'd expected resistance. Places like this thrived on it. But she wasn't here to beg. She was here for Lucas, for their 10 years, for the memory of his pale hand brushing hers over a shared plate a decade ago. "I understand it's busy," Elena said, her voice steady, her eyes locked on Madison's. "It's for a special anniversary, my husband and me. This place means a lot to us." She let the words hang, a quiet plea, wrapped in resolve, hoping they'd pierce the armor of Madison's indifference. But Madison's gaze only hardened, her fingers tightening on the reservation book as if guarding a sacred relic. The air between them thickened, charged with an unspoken tension that Elena could taste, bitter, metallic, like the edge of a storm. Madison's eyes flicked over her again, lingering on the gray sweater, the jeans, and the tan skin that seemed to offend her very presence. "Fully booked," she repeated, her tone final, a door slamming shut. Elena's heart thudded, but she held her ground, her smile a fragile shield against the rejection she felt coiling around her. She wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The air in the pinnacle hung heavy, a taut thread stretched between Elena Reyes and Madison, the matron whose icy rejection had just landed like a slap. Elena stood firm at the podium, her gray sweater a quiet rebellion against the room's glittering excess, her tan skin a silent challenge to its unspoken rules. Her words, "It's for a special anniversary. My husband and me. This place means a lot to us," still echoed in her ears unanswered, as Madison's gaze bore into her with the weight of a judge's gavel. The reservation book lay untouched beneath Madison's manicured hands, a fortress gate Elena couldn't breach. The dining room's hum buzzed around them, clinking glasses, murmured boasts, the soft scrape of forks on porcelain. But here at the heart of it, time seemed to stall, suspended in the chill of Madison's silence. Elena's chest tightened, but she held her ground. Her smile, a fragile lifeline. She wasn't naive. She'd walked into enough rooms like this to know the game. How her presence, her brownness, her chalk-dusted jeans could unsettle the polished order of places built for wealth and whiteness. But this wasn't about them. It was about Lucas, about their 10 years together, about a night she'd planned to reclaim from their past. She opened her mouth to press again, to weave her warmth through Madison's frost, when the air shifted. A sudden gust of arrogance cutting through the lavender-scented stillness. Footsteps, sharp and deliberate, clicked against the marble, and a shadow loomed over the podium. Everett Lawson burst into the scene like a storm breaking over a calm sea. He was a white man in his 50s, broad-shouldered and loud. His tailored suit, a canvas of privilege, stretched tight across his frame. His face, ruddy from wine or temper, carried the smug assurance of someone who owned every room he entered. He didn't glance at Elena. Not yet. Just barreled past her to the podium, his voice booming over the dining room's hum. "Madison, my table's not ready. What's the holdup? I told you I wanted the 85 Italian red decanted by now." His words were a whip crack, demanding, entitled, and the room seemed to bend toward him, a ripple of deference spreading through the waitstaff. Madison's demeanor flipped like a switch. The cold mask she'd worn for Elena melted into a fawning smile, her posture softening as she turned to Everett. "Right away, Mr. Lawson," she cooed, her voice dripping with a warmth Elena hadn't been offered. "I'll see to it immediately." Her hands fluttered over the reservation book, suddenly alive, as if Everett's presence had jolted her into motion. Elena stood there, a silent spectator to this transformation, her own request still dangling unanswered. The contrast stung, sharp, bitter, a reminder of the hierarchies she'd navigated her whole life. She swallowed it down, her jaw tightening, and tried again. "As I was saying," but Everett cut her off, his head swiveling toward her at last, his eyes pale blue and hard as flint, raked over her, taking in her gray sweater, her jeans, and her tan skin in one swift, dismissive sweep. He didn't speak to her, not directly. Instead, he leaned toward Madison, his voice dropping into a stage whisper meant to carry. "I thought this place had standards," he said, his lips curling into a sneer. "Who let her in here?" The words landed like a punch, loud enough to draw a few heads from nearby tables, a soft chuckle rippling through the diners like a dark tide. Elena's cheeks burned, the heat rising fast, but she rooted herself to the spot, her breath steadying against the humiliation. She met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm just trying to reserve a table for next week," she said, her voice calm but firm, slicing through his mockery. "Not dining tonight." Everett snorted, a harsh bark of a laugh, and turned fully to face her, his bulk looming over the podium. "This isn't some dive bar, sweetheart," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. He gestured at her jeans, the chalk smudges stark against the denim. "You've got to dress the part or don't bother showing up." His hand waved dismissively, as if swatting away a fly, and he turned back to Madison, expecting her to echo his disdain. Madison's eyes flicked between them, her smile faltering for a heartbeat before settling into a practiced neutrality. She cleared her throat, a small, uncomfortable sound, but said nothing, her silence a tacit agreement with Everett's judgment. Elena felt the room tilt, the weight of their combined dismissal pressing against her ribs. The diners watched now, some openly, some from the corners of their eyes, a spectacle unfolding over their foie gras and champagne. A man in a velvet blazer smirked into his glass. A woman with pearls clutched her napkin, her lips pursed in faint amusement. Elena's pulse hammered, but she refused to shrink. This wasn't about them. She told herself again, it was about Lucas, about their love, about a reservation she wouldn't let slip through her fingers. "Sir," she said, her voice rising just enough to reclaim the space, addressing Everett directly now. "I'm not here to disrupt it, just to book a table." Her words were measured, a lifeline thrown into the rising tension. But Everett didn't bite. He rolled his eyes, a theatrical gesture, and muttered to Madison, "Handle this, will you? My guests are waiting." He strode off toward a table near the window, his laughter trailing behind him like a taunt, leaving Elena alone with Madison once more. The maitre d' straightened, her composure snapping back into place, but the air between them crackled, charged with the venom Everett had unleashed. Elena's hands clenched at her sides, the chalk on her fingers smearing into her palms. She wasn't done, not yet. She turned back to Madison, her resolve a steel thread running through her spine, ready to push past this new wall, blind to the chaos it would soon ignite. The echo of Everett Lawson's laughter still hung in the air of the pinnacle, a venomous thread weaving through the dining room's gilded hum. Elena Reyes stood at the maitre podium, her dark eyes locked on Madison, whose silence had hardened into a wall of indifference after Everett's departure. The reservation book remained closed beneath Madison's hands, a mute testament to the rejection Elena refused to accept. Her gray sweater felt suddenly too warm, the chalk smudges on her jeans a glaring mark under the chandelier's relentless glow. The room watched, some diners with open curiosity, others with thinly veiled smirks, as the tension coiled tighter, a spring ready to snap. Elena's pulse thumped in her ears, but her voice stayed steady, a lifeline in the storm. "Like I said, it's for next week. I'm not here to cause trouble." Madison's lips twitched, a flicker of something, discomfort. Perhaps before her professionalism snapped back into place, she leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a low, cutting whisper. "It's not about money," she said, her eyes flicking over Elena's tan skin and her simple clothes. "We serve a certain clientele." The words landed like a blade, sharp and deliberate, slicing through Elena's calm. The implication was unmistakable. Her ethnicity, her unpolished presence, didn't belong in this temple of wealth. Elena's breath caught, a familiar ache blooming in her chest, but she held Madison's gaze, refusing to let the sting show. She'd faced this before, carried it like a second skin, but tonight it burned deeper, fueled by the purpose she'd come for. Lucas, their anniversary, their history tied to this very place. Before she could respond, a voice boomed from across the room, shattering the fragile quiet. "Some folks don't know their place," Everett Lawson called from his table by the window. His ruddy face split by a grin. He raised his glass, the red wine sloshing as he gestured toward Elena. "This isn't a handout." Laughter erupted, a dark ripple spreading through the nearby tables, harsh barks from men in tuxedos, tittering giggles from women dripping in jewels. The sound clawed at Elena's resolve, each chuckle a barb sinking into her pride. Her cheeks flushed, heat surging up her neck, but she rooted herself to the marble floor, her hands clenching at her sides. She wouldn't crumble. Not here. Not now. The dining room's attention sharpened, a spotlight she hadn't asked for. A man in a velvet jacket leaned toward his date, muttering something that drew a smirk. A woman with a pearl choker tilted her head, her lips pursed in faint amusement. Elena felt their eyes like pinpricks, stripping her down to her skin, her clothes, her very being. She straightened, her voice rising to reclaim the space. "I'm just trying to make a reservation," she said, addressing Madison again. Her tone measured but firm. "That's all." But Madison's expression didn't soften. If anything, it grew colder, her hands still guarding the reservation book like a sacred relic. Then came the footsteps, brisk, authoritative, cutting through the laughter like a blade through silk. Margaret, the manager, emerged from the shadows of the dining room, her heels clicking against the marble with a rhythm that promised order. She was a woman in her 40s, her blonde hair swept into an elegant twist, her black dress hugging her frame like a uniform of power. Her eyes, green and piercing, fixed on Elena as she approached, narrowing with each step. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice smooth but edged, directed at Madison. The maitresse straightened, her tone slick as oil. "This woman's leaving," she replied, gesturing toward Elena with a flick of her wrist. Elena's jaw tightened, the lie sparking a flare of defiance. "Actually, I'm not," she said, turning to Margaret, her voice steady despite the heat in her chest. "I'm trying to book a table for a special occasion, my husband and me." She let the words hang, a quiet assertion of her right to be there, but Margaret's gaze didn't waver. It swept over her from her unstyled curls to her scuffed sneakers and settled into something hard, unyielding. "You're disturbing our guests," Margaret said, her tone clipped, her head tilting toward Everett's table, where he watched with a smug grin, his wineglass raised in mock salute. Elena's heart thudded, disbelief warring with the anger rising in her throat. "Disturbing them?" she echoed, her eyes flicking to the diners, their amusement now a palpable weight. "I'm standing here asking for a reservation. How is that?" Everett cut in, his voice carrying over the room like a trumpet. "Some people don't get it," he crowed, leaning back in his chair. "This isn't your kind of place." More laughter followed, louder now, a chorus of disdain that drowned her words. A woman in a red gown clapped a hand over her mouth, stifling a giggle. A man with a gold watch shook his head, smirking into his plate. Margaret stepped closer, her presence a wall of authority. "Enough," she said, her voice low but firm, her eyes locked on Elena. "You need to leave." The command was final, a gavel striking. But Elena didn't move. Her hands trembled, the chalk smearing into her palms, but her spine stayed straight. "I just want to book a table," she repeated, quieter now, the words a plea wrapped in steel. Margaret's lips thinned, her patience fraying. "You're not welcome here," she said, her tone dropping to a hiss. "Not like this." The room seemed to close in, the laughter and stares a tightening noose. Elena's breath hitched, the humiliation searing through her, but she held her ground, her eyes burning with a fire she wouldn't let them snuff out. This was for Lucas, for their love. And she wouldn't let it end here. Not yet. The air in the pinnacle crackled with a venomous edge. The laughter from Everett Lawson's table still rang in Elena Reyes's ears like a taunt carved in stone. She stood rooted before the maitre podium, her gray sweater clinging to her frame, her tan skin a defiant contrast to the room's pale opulence. Margaret, the manager, loomed closer, her green eyes glinting with cold authority. Her words, "You're not welcome here, not like this," hung between them like a guillotine's blade. The dining room's chatter had dulled to a hushed buzz, the elite of Phoenix now a rapt audience to the spectacle unfolding under the chandelier's golden glow. Elena's hands trembled at her sides, the chalk smudges on her jeans smearing into her palms, but her voice held firm, a thread of steel woven through the fire in her chest. "I just want to book a table," she said again, quieter now, her eyes locked on Margaret's unyielding stare. Margaret's lips thinned into a razor's edge, her patience fraying like a worn rope. "I've asked you to leave," she said, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper, each syllable a shard of ice. "Do it now, or I'll have you removed." The threat landed heavy, a stone sinking into Elena's gut. But she didn't flinch. Disbelief surged through her, warring with the anger that burned hotter with every passing second. "Removed?" she echoed, her tone rising just enough to pierce the room's hush. "How is reserving a table a reason to throw me out?" Her eyes darted to the diners, some smirking, some averting their gazes, searching for a shred of reason in this gilded cage. Everett's voice cut through again, a bellow from his windowside throne. "Some people need it spelled out twice," he crowed, leaning back in his chair, his ruddy face split by a grin. "Get her out already." The words drew another wave of laughter, sharp and cruel, rippling through the tables like a dark tide. A man in a velvet blazer clapped his hands once, a bark of amusement. A woman in a red gown hid her smirk behind a napkin. Elena's cheeks blazed, the humiliation a living thing clawing at her insides, but she refused to bow. She turned back to Margaret, her breath shallow, her resolve a flickering flame. She wouldn't let them snuff it. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I'm a customer, same as anyone here." Margaret's gaze hardened, her head tilting toward Everett's table as if his presence were a silent command. "Enough," she snapped, her tone final, a judge's verdict. She raised a hand, a swift, imperious gesture, and called out, "James." A young man in a black uniform emerged from the shadows near the entrance, his steps hesitant, his face a mask of unease. He was barely 20, his brown eyes wide with discomfort as he approached, his hands hovering awkwardly at his sides. "Escort her out," Margaret ordered, her voice a whip crack that left no room for doubt. James faltered, his gaze flicking to Elena, then back to Margaret. But he nodded, duty overriding reluctance. Elena's heart thudded, a wild drumbeat against her ribs. "Wait," she said, her voice rising now, desperation threading through her calm. "My husband is—" She stopped, the words catching in her throat as Margaret's lips curled into a mocking smirk. "Someone important, I'm sure," the manager interrupted, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "We hear that all the time. It doesn't change anything." The dismissal was a slap, sharp and stinging, and Elena's breath hitched, her mind racing. She wanted to say it. "Lucas Reyes, the tech billionaire. My white husband who turned your world upside down." But the words wouldn't come, choked by the absurdity of needing to prove herself to these strangers. James stepped closer, his voice soft, almost apologetic. "Ma'am, please," he said, his hand hovering near her elbow, careful not to touch. "Come with me." Elena's eyes flashed to him, then back to Margaret, her defiance flaring one last time. "You're throwing me out for this?" she asked, her voice low, trembling with a fury she could barely contain. "For trying to make a reservation?" Margaret's expression didn't waver. "You're causing a scene," she said, her tone flat. "Final. Leave." Everett chimed in again, his laughter a grating echo. "Finally too poor to stay, huh?" The room erupted once more, the sound of a dagger twisting in Elena's pride. She stood frozen, the weight of their scorn pressing down, crushing. James shifted uncomfortably, his hands still outstretched, his eyes pleading. "Ma'am," he murmured, softer now, a quiet urging. Elena's gaze swept the room, the smirking faces, the averted eyes, the indifference of wealth, and something inside her snapped, not in defeat, but in resolve. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. With a slow, deliberate breath, she turned, letting James guide her toward the door. Her sneakers squeaked on the marble, each step a drum roll of her exit. The laughter trailing her like a shadow. The glass door loomed ahead, a portal back to the night she'd left behind. As James held it open, his eyes downcast, Elena paused, her voice a whisper meant only for herself. "You'll see." She stepped out, the cool air hitting her flushed face like a balm, the city's hum swallowing the echoes of the dining room. Her hand found her phone, her fingers trembling as she gripped it. The sting of rejection, raw and pulsing. She didn't know Lucas's Bentley was already rounding the corner, its sleek frame a promise of reckoning. She couldn't yet see. The night air outside the pinnacle wrapped around Elena Reyes like a cold embrace, the October chill seeping through her gray sweater as she stood on the sidewalk. Her breath fogging in faint wisps, the glass door had swung shut behind her with a final hollow thud, severing her from the dining room's gilded scorn. Her sneakers gripped the pavement, rooting her to the spot, while the echoes of Everett Lawson's laughter and Margaret's icy command, "Leave," still clawed at her mind. Her tan skin prickled with the sting of humiliation, her hands trembling as they clutched her phone. The screen, a dim glow against the city's twilight. She'd been cast out, her simple request for a reservation twisted into a public shaming, and the weight of it pressed against her chest, a bruise she couldn't shake. Her fingers hovered over Lucas's name, hesitating when a low, resonant purr broke through the street's hum, a sound that turned her head and quickened her pulse. A sleek black Bentley Continental glided to a stop at the curb, its polished curves catching the golden spill from the Pinnacle's windows. The engine's growl softened to a whisper as the driver's door opened and Lucas Reyes stepped out, a figure of quiet power against the night. At 36, he was a white man whose pale skin and sharp features belied the fire that had built his tech empire. His navy suit hugged his lean frame, the fabric whispering wealth without shouting it, and his sandy hair caught the streetlight's glow. As he straightened, he'd finished a meeting early, a rare break in his relentless schedule, and remembered Alina's offhand mention of stopping by the Pinnacle. A surprise, he'd thought. A chance to sweep her off her feet. He hadn't expected to find her standing alone outside, her silhouette framed by the restaurant's glow, a question flickering in his mind. Inside, the dining room hummed on, oblivious to the shift brewing beyond its walls. The chandeliers cast their golden haze over white tablecloths, the clink of crystal and murmur of privilege unbroken. Everett Lawson held court at his window table, his boisterous laugh punctuating a story for his guests, while Margaret glided back to her post, her heels clicking with restored order. Madison stood at the podium, her black suit crisp, her hands smoothing the reservation book as if wiping away the mess of Elena's presence. The room had settled, the spectacle forgotten, until the glass door swung open again, a gust of cool air slicing through the lavender-scented warmth. Lucas stepped inside, his presence a quiet thunder that rippled through the space. His height filled the doorway, his blue eyes scanning the room with a precision honed by years of boardroom battles. The chatter dipped, a subtle hitch, as heads turned, some with curiosity, others with recognition. His name carried weight in Phoenix, a whisper of billions and innovation. But tonight, he was just a man looking for his wife. His gaze swept past the diners, past Everett's smug grin, and landed on Alina's figure through the glass, standing alone on the sidewalk. A crease furrowed his brow, confusion hardening into something sharper, something protective. Madison's head snapped up, her practiced smile blooming as she registered his suit, his bearing. "Good evening, sir," she said, her voice smooth and professional, a stark contrast to the frost she'd offered Elena. "Welcome to the Pinnacle. Do you have a reservation?" Lucas's steps carried him to the podium, his shoes silent on the marble, his expression unreadable but edged with a quiet intensity. "I'm meeting my wife," he said, his voice low, steady, a current running beneath the calm. "Reyes, Lucas Reyes." The name dropped like a stone into still water, and Madison's smile faltered, a flicker of recognition widening her eyes. She knew that name. Everyone in Phoenix's circles did, a white tech titan whose wealth could buy this restaurant 10 times over. Her hands hesitated over the reservation book, her composure slipping for a heartbeat before she recovered. "Mr. Reyes," she said, her tone brightening, though a thread of uncertainty wove through it. "I don't believe we have you down for tonight." Lucas's gaze didn't waver, his eyes locking onto hers with a weight that made her straighten. "That's because my wife came to make one," he said, his words deliberate, each one a step closer to the truth he sensed lurking. "For our anniversary next week." She just stepped out, it seems. He nodded toward the window where Elena stood, her phone still in hand, her silhouette a stark outline against the night. Madison's smile froze, her mind racing behind her polished mask. She'd just dismissed a woman in a gray sweater, a Latina woman who didn't fit the Pinnacle's mold. But now this man, this name stood before her, tying that woman to a world she hadn't imagined. "Your wife was here?" she asked, her voice tiptoeing around the question, testing the ground. Lucas's head tilted, his eyes narrowing slightly, a storm gathering in their depths. "Yes," he said, his tone still calm, but laced with an edge that made the air tighten. "She mentioned our anniversary. You'd..." Remember her dark hair, gray sweater. Sound familiar? The room seemed to hold its breath, the diner's chatter fading to a distant drone. Madison's fingers twitched on the podium, her throat bobbing as she swallowed, the pieces clicking into place. Too late. Outside, Elena lifted her head, the Bentley's gleam catching her eye, a spark of recognition igniting in her chest. Lucas was here, her Lucas, and the night was about to turn on its axis. A reckoning she hadn't planned but couldn't stop. The glass door of the pinnacle stood as a silent sentinel, its polished surface reflecting the golden glow within, and the shadowed figure of Elena Reyes beyond. She lingered on the sidewalk, her breath misting in the October chill, her dark eyes fixed on the sleek Bentley that had just rolled to a stop. Her phone trembled in her hand, the sting of her expulsion still raw, a wound carved by Madison's frost and Margaret's steel. Inside, Lucas Reyes stood at the Maytrade podium, his navy suit a quiet testament to his power, his voice a low rumble as he pressed Madison with a question that hung like a storm cloud. "You'd remember, her dark hair, gray sweater. Sound familiar?" The words tightened the air and Madison's smile cracked, her pale face draining of color as realization dawned, a shadow creeping over her polished mask. Madison's lips parted, a stammer forming. But Lucas didn't wait. He turned, his steps swift and sure, and pushed the door open, the cool night air rushing in behind him. "Elena," he called, his voice soft but firm, cutting through the city's hum. She looked up, her breath catching as their eyes met, his blue sharp with concern, hers dark, flickering with a mix of relief and hurt. He extended a hand, his pale fingers steady, and she took it, her chalk-dusted palm sliding into his. With a gentle pull, he drew her back inside, the door swinging shut with a thud that echoed like a gavel strike. The dining room's chatter filtered, a ripple of unease spreading as the couple stepped into the light, an unspoken challenge in their united stance. "Everything okay?" Lucas asked, his voice low, meant only for her, his thumb brushing her knuckles. Elena's gaze held his, her lips pressing into a thin line before she answered. "Not quite." Her tone was steady, but beneath it ran a current of emotion, anger, exhaustion, the weight of the rejection she'd just endured. Lucas's brow furrowed, his eyes searching hers, then flicking back to Madison, who stood frozen at the podium, her hands clutching the reservation book like a lifeline. The room watched, the clink of glasses and murmur of voices fading to a tense hush. The air thick with anticipation. Margaret emerged from the dining room's depths, her heels clicking a sharp rhythm against the marble, her blonde hair glinting under the chandeliers. She'd sensed the shift, the disturbance at the entrance, and her green eyes narrowed as she approached, taking in Lucas's suit, his bearing, and Elena beside him in her gray sweater. "Is there an issue?" she asked, her voice smooth but edged, a blade sheathed in silk. Lucas turned to her, his posture unwavering, his calm a storm held in check. "Yes," he said, his words deliberate, each one a stone dropped into still water. "I understand my wife was just asked to leave your establishment." Margaret's professional mask slipped, a flicker of surprise crossing her face before she regained her composure. "A misunderstanding," she said quickly, her eyes darting between Lucas's unmistakable wealth and Elena's casual attire, her mind racing to reconcile the two. "We have certain standards for our guests." Her tone was practiced, a defense she'd wielded before, but it faltered under Lucas's gaze. He tilted his head, his voice steady but laced with an edge that made the air shiver. "Standards?" he repeated, the word hanging like a challenge. "What standards exactly would stop my wife from making a reservation?" The question landed like a thunderclap, reverberating through the room. Madison's face blanched further, her fingers tightening on the podium, her earlier dismissal of Elena now a ghost haunting her silence. Margaret opened her mouth, a response forming, but before she could speak, a voice boomed from the window table, shattering the tension like glass. She was disruptive. Everett Lawson bellowed, leaning forward in his chair, his ruddy face flushed with wine and bravado. He gestured toward Elena with a meaty hand, his gold cufflink glinting. "Some people don't belong in a place like this." The dining room froze, every eye swiveling to Everett, then back to Lucas and Elena. The laughter that had once buoyed his taunts was gone, replaced by a charged stillness. Lucas turned slowly, his blue eyes locking onto Everett with a precision that could cut steel. "And you are?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm, a predator sizing up prey. Everett puffed out his chest, undeterred, his grin widening. "Everett Lawson?" he declared, his tone dripping with self-importance. "Regular here. I know how things work." He leaned back, expecting deference, oblivious to the shift in the room's gravity. Lucas's head tilted, his gaze sharpening. "You weighed in on how they treated my wife?" he asked, his words soft but lethal, a blade sliding from its sheath. Everett's confidence wavered, a flicker of doubt creasing his brow. But he doubled down, his voice rising. She didn't look it. He waved at Elena's jeans, her sweater, and her tan skin, as if they were evidence in a trial. Elena's hand tightened in Lucas's, her breath steadying. Her silence, a strength. He felt it like a current. The room held its breath. The diner's face is a gallery of shock and curiosity, the air electric, with the truth about to break. Margaret stepped forward, her voice lowering to a placating hush. "Sir, perhaps we can discuss this privately." But Lucas's eyes didn't leave Everett, and Elena's presence beside him was a quiet fire, unyielding. The confrontation had begun. A reckoning poised to unravel the Pinnacle's fragile facade. The Pinnacle's dining room hung in a charged silence, the air thick with the weight of Lucas Reyes's question. "You weighed in on how they treated my wife?" A quiet blade that sliced through Everett Lawson's bluster. Lucas stood beside Elena, his navy suit a stark contrast to her gray sweater, his pale hand clasped around her tan one, their unity a defiant beacon under the chandelier's golden glow. Everett's ruddy face faltered, his grin twitching as he registered the steel in Lucas's blue eyes. But he clung to his bravado, his voice a rough bark. "She didn't fit. Look at her." The words echoed, a last gasp of arrogance, and the room's stillness deepened. Every diner a witness to the storm breaking. Lucas's gaze didn't waver, his calm a furnace held in check. He stepped forward, his voice rising just enough to carry, each word a hammer striking stone. "My wife, Elena Reyes." He began, his tone steady, deliberate. "Community advocate, board member of the Reyes Foundation, the woman who just wanted to book our anniversary dinner here, where we had our first date. 10 years ago." The revelation landed like thunder, reverberating through the marble hall. Madison at the podium froze, her hands gripping the reservation book, as if it could shield her from the truth. Margaret's green eyes widened, her professional mask cracking, her mind scrambling to rewrite the narrative she'd spun. Everett's mouth opened then shut, his confidence crumbling like dry earth under the weight of Lucas's words. Elena stood tall beside him, her tan skin catching the light, her silence a strength that spoke louder than the taunts she'd endured. The diners' faces shifted, smirks fading, eyes darting, a gallery of discomfort replacing their earlier amusement. Lucas's voice softened, but the edge remained, a blade honed by love and fury. "She came here for us," he said, his gaze sweeping the room. "And you judged her by her sweater. Her skin, not her worth." The accusation hung, a mirror held up to the Pinnacle's gilded prejudice, and the room seemed to shrink under its reflection. A sudden movement broke the hush. James, the young staffer who escorted Elena out, stepped forward from the shadows. His black uniform hung loose on his slight frame, his brown eyes blazing with a fire that belied his earlier hesitation. "She tried explaining," he said, his voice trembling but clear, cutting through the silence like a bell. "Several times, no one listened." He reached for his jacket, tugging it off with a sharp jerk, and tossed it onto the podium beside Madison. "I quit," he declared, his words a gunshot in the stillness. "I'm done with this." Madison's head snapped toward him, her composure shattering. "James, don't be ridiculous," she started, but he shook his head, his resolve a wall she couldn't breach. The room stirred, a ripple of shock spreading, but it wasn't over. From a table near the back, an elderly couple rose, their movements slow but deliberate. The woman, her silver hair swept into an elegant bun, wore a simple black dress that whispered old money. Her husband, stooped but steady, adjusted his tie with a trembling hand. They crossed the dining room, their steps a quiet drumbeat, and stopped before Lucas and Elena. "Young man," the woman said, her voice carrying the weight of decades, "you're right." She turned, her gaze sweeping the staff, Madison, Margaret, the waiters frozen mid-step. "We've dined here 15 years, she continued. "But tonight's the last. This place used to value character. Now it's just appearances." Her husband nodded, his voice gruff but firm. "We're done," he said, his eyes on Everett, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his wine glass forgotten. The couple's stand was a crack in the Pinnacle's facade, a fracture that widened as whispers spread among the diners. Everett cleared his throat, his bravado flickering back to life. "Now, Margaret," he said, addressing the elderly woman with forced familiarity, "you're overreacting." But she cut him off, her tone sharp. "No, Everett, you don't get to decide what's right here." The rebuke silenced him, his face reddening as the room's attention turned. a spotlight he hadn't bargained for. Elena's hand tightened in Lucas's, her breath steadying as the tide shifted. She felt no triumph, only a quiet ache for the ugliness laid bare. "Lucas," she murmured, her voice soft, a tether pulling him back. "Let's go." He turned to her, his eyes softening, but the fire still burned. "Not yet," he said, then faced Margaret, who'd stepped forward, her hands clasped in a desperate bid for control. "Mr. Reyes," she said, her voice strained, "please, let's discuss this privately." But Elena spoke, her words clear, cutting through the plea. "You were clear about your standards," she said, her gaze locking onto Margaret's. "I didn't meet them." Lucas nodded, his decision made. "Our anniversary was about values," he said, his voice ringing out. "Real ones. This place doesn't fit." He turned, guiding Elena toward the door, her sneakers squeaking faintly on the marble. James followed, his steps lighter now, his voice breaking the silence as he caught up. "Thank you," he said, his eyes on them both, "for standing up." The glass door loomed ahead, a portal back to the night. And as they reached it, the dining room watched, a tableau of shock, shame, and a truth they couldn't unsee. The night air beyond the pinnacle swallowed Elena and Lucas Reyes as they stepped away from its glass doors. The echoes of Everett Lawson's faltering bravado and Margaret's hollow pleas fading into the city's hum. Elena's gray sweater brushed against Lucas's navy suit as they walked, her tan hand still clasped in his pale one, a quiet strength binding them. The Bentley gleamed at the curb, a silent witness to the storm they'd left behind, but their steps carried them past it, toward a future unshackled by the restaurant's gilded chains. James trailed a few paces behind, his uniform jacket shed, his young face alight with a purpose he'd found in their stand. The October sky stretched above, a canopy of stars piercing the urban glow. And Elena felt the weight of the evening lift, a bruise fading under the promise of something truer. 3 weeks later, the air held a sharper bite. The city settling into late fall. Elena stood outside a modest brick building on Phoenix's west side, its windows spilling warm light onto the cracked sidewalk. A simple sign read, "Community Hearth," and through the glass she saw long wooden tables crowded with people. Families, loners, workers in worn coats. Their laughter a raw, honest melody. She wore a plain dress now, her curls loose, her chalk-dusted jeans traded for comfort over pretense. Lucas stood beside her, his tie absent, his sandy hair ruffled by the breeze. Tonight was their anniversary. 10 years since that first date at the Pinnacle, and they'd chosen this place, a pay-what-you-can eatery, where worth wasn't measured by wealth or skin. Inside, the air smelled of garlic and fresh bread, the clatter of plates a lively rhythm. A young server greeted them with a grin, no judgment in her eyes, and led them to a table beside a family celebrating a child's birthday, balloons bobbing above their heads. Across from them sat an elderly man, his hands trembling as he spooned soup, his smile shy but genuine. Elena settled into her chair, her shoulders easing, the memory of the Pinnacle's chandeliers replaced by this unpolished warmth. Lucas reached for her hand under the table, his blue eyes soft. "Happy anniversary," he murmured, and she smiled, the ache of that night 3 weeks ago a distant echo now. The meal was simple. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, a slice of cornbread that crumbled under her fork, but it tasted of care, of community. Conversations flowed around them, unscripted and free, laughter erupting as a child smeared icing on his father's cheek. Elena watched, her heart swelling, and thought of James. He'd reached out days after that night, his voice crackling with excitement over the phone. With her guidance, he'd pitched a program to the Reyes Foundation, education for struggling youth, a bridge built from his own experience, and it had been funded. A seed planted from the ashes of the Pinnacle's Prejudice. Tonight, he'd join them here, a guest in this space that welcomed all. The door swung open, and James stepped in, his lanky frame wrapped in a worn jacket, his brown eyes bright. He spotted them and waved, weaving through the tables with a grin. "You made it," Elena said as he sat, her voice warm. "Wouldn't miss it," he replied, his gaze sweeping the room. "This place, it's real." Lucas nodded, his hand still in Elena's. "It's what we wanted," he said. "A celebration that fits us." The server brought James a plate, and they ate together. The clink of forks, a quiet harmony, the night a testament to values forged beyond appearances. Beyond these walls, the Pinnacle had faltered. A scathing article in the Phoenix Tribune had sparked whispers, then outrage, its exclusivity laid bare. Margaret had resigned. Madison had followed, her letter to Elena a raw confession of regret, not just for that night, but for a pattern she now sought to unlearn. The restaurant had changed hands, its new sign promising all welcome, a fragile vow to mend what had broken. Elena had read Madison's words, felt their weight, and set them aside. Not forgiven, not yet, but open to the possibility of growth. Under the community hearth's dim lights, Elena leaned into Lucas, her voice a whisper. "Worth isn't skin or status," she said, her eyes tracing the faces around them. "It's this. Character, connection." Lucas squeezed her hand, his voice low. "You've always known that," he said, "and you keep showing me." The stars outside glittered, a silent chorus, and Elena thought of their first date, his pale hand brushing hers, their love a defiance of the world's rules. That night at the Pinnacle had tested them. But here, in this unassuming haven, they'd reclaimed it. James leaned forward, his voice breaking her reverie. "You two changed things," he said, his tone earnest. "Not just for me, for everyone. They've pushed out." Elena smiled, small but real. "It's not over," she said. "It's just starting." The night stretched on, warm and alive, a meaningful end to a story that had begun with rejection and ended with truth. A truth Phoenix, and they wouldn't forget. As Elena and Lucas's story fades into Phoenix's night, we'd love to hear from you. What did their journey stir in your heart? Share your thoughts below. Your voice matters to us. Thank you for joining us on this ride through prejudice and triumph. It's your presence that makes these tales come alive. Stay with us. More stories of truth and resilience are on the way. Until next time, take care and keep shining.